What's good, my dear language learning master? Well, welcome to a new episode of the Language Input Podcast, in which, as you probably already know, I'm going to talk about different topics related to the language learning process. And my main goal with it is to help as many people realize that we can all learn any language when join the process, every step of the way. Like, I'm totally convinced. And that the fact that you may have not been able to learn your favorite language yet doesn't mean that you're not good at languages, that you're too old or too young, that it's never going to happen, that you're not talented for languages, etc. Right? No, it just means, it's all about the approach. Like, pretty much, we've all had the same type of education when it comes to language learning. So we've all grown accustomed to, memorizing vocabulary lists and consciously learning grammar rules and so on, which is a horrible approach, to say the least. And so that's the reason why you haven't been able to learn your favorite language so far. Not because there's something wrong with you or similar ideas. Like, believe me, because I've been on both sides. like I said in the previous episode, I'm telling you this from the bottom of my heart. Like, you can do it while enjoying the process. And again, it's not delusional motivational stuff. I'm actually convinced. All right, because we all learn our native languages, right? It worked for every single one of us. So, we all have that possibility, right? We all have that. It's not really a skill, but we all can do it. That's the that's the bottom line. Okay. And so with that being said, let's get into today's episode. Today's topic. And today I want to talk about, the different levels of difficulty when learning a language. Whether there certain languages were more difficult than others or not. Okay, because we've all seen a lot of videos, blog posts, and podcast episodes or whatever, in which people talk about the most difficult languages in the world. Like, it's usually Finnish or Polish or Hungarian or and then in a different post or whatever it is, they talk about the easiest languages to learn, right? And first of all, I'm going to explain my opinion. I'm going to explain why I think there's no such a thing as a more difficult language or an easier one. And first of all, obviously, for me as a native Spanish speaker, Polish might seem like an extraordinarily difficult language to learn, while the same language, Polish, might seem way easier for a person from the Czech Republic or Slovakia or even Russia, right? So, first of all, if your native language is somewhat related to the language you're trying to learn, that specific language is going to be way different, or is going to be not really harder or easier. I'll get to that in a moment, but let's say that it's going to be easier for you to learn. For me to learn Italian than to a Chinese person to learn Italian, right? To give you an example. So first of all, just talking about one specific language being the most difficult to learn doesn't make any sense for that reason, because, like I said, a specific language might seem unbelievably hard for someone to learn, but from another person with a similar, whose native language similar to that we're talking about, it might not be as hard, right? Or it might not seem as hard. So that's the first reason why I think it doesn't make any sense, all right? But the main reason is because I believe when people talk about the most difficult languages and the easiest ones, they're basing their judgment on grammar, on the grammar structures, on to get back to the example of Polish. As a I'll talk about my personal experience. Like for me, as a native Spanish speaker, when I started learning Italian, I could understand quite a bit already, and some of the extractors are somewhat similar because of their common origin, that being Latin, right? Whereas with Polish, if you look at the actual grammar, if you look at it from a traditional grammar approach perspective, obviously it's gonna look like the hardest task in the world, because the languages are not related. They have like 7 different cases, declensions, or whatever you want to call them, feminine, masculine, and neutral words, and so on, right? So from that perspective, yeah, obviously Polish might seem harder than Italian in that case, right? But once again, I get back to the first idea that for a person from the Czech Republic, it might be the other way around, all right? But anyway, my point is, based on the actual grammar, there might be, like more complex and easier languages. Like, for example, even though I'm not sure if there are some people who actually use the language, but Esperanto, from a grammar standpoint, is actually quite simple, right? I believe. Like, I've never tried to learn it or anything, but the key here is to understand that that's solely based on grammar, on the language itself. That has nothing, once again, that has nothing to do with the actual language acquisition process. So my point here is we all have the ability, we all have that in our brains. We all can learn any language, because, it's not that, to give you an example, it's not that Chinese kids are born with a specific chip in their brain to learn Chinese. No, I mean, they learn Chinese because they're immersed in a Chinese culture and they're listening to Chinese all the time. And same for Japanese, for Spanish, for English, for Swahili, for Urdu, whatever the language. Kids are not born with a specific chip to learn that specific language. They learn the language because they're immersed in that culture, because they're listening to that language, right? So, likewise, the actual or the true language acquisition process has nothing to do with that. So, to me, there's no more difficult or easier language. It's just there's indeed one difference that I'll talk about in a moment, okay? But it's not about the language being more difficult or easier. And before I get into that, the reason I'm creating this episode, and the reason I'm talking about that, is because sometimes I see it all the time. Someone would like to learn a specific language for whatever the reason, because they're in love with that culture. Or, like, to give you an example, I had one subscriber, one person on YouTube tell me that she was interested in learning Hindi because she was like amazed by the culture. She'd love to live in India. She was in love with the whole, the whole Indian culture. And everyone was telling her to learn English because it was the practical language to learn, right? The one she's going to use at work, or, But she wasn't interested in it. She wanted to learn Hindi, because of her interests in the culture, right? And I have the feeling because of that idea of, this specific language being more difficult or this other one being easier, that specific person might end up giving up because, she thinks is going to be way harder to learn another language. And again, that's based on the traditional grammar approach, on grammar, on the actual structures of the language, which have nothing to do with the actual language acquisition process. Again, So that's the reason why I'm making this episode and why I think this is important, because, like I'm always saying, I want everyone to understand that we can all learn any language when during the process. So if you're interested in learning a language that might seem difficult in paper, I don't want you to give up because of that. Okay, so that's the main reason why I'm talking about this. And yeah. But getting back to what I said before, I don't think languages are harder or easier. And I'll give you my personal example with, Italian versus Polish, which is what I talked about, like a related language to my native Spanish, Italian, and then a different one in Polish. And, it seems like it doesn't seem like it's actually taking me longer to learn Polish than to learn Italian. But I don't think it is because one is easier or the other is harder. I think it's because, first of all, because of the similarities between Italian and Spanish, I'm gonna get access to more different resources or more interesting resources sooner with Italian because of their similarities and my ability to understand Italian because of it, as a result of it. Right, so I've talked about it many times, but when I started learning Italian, I could understand cartoons right away. And I kept watching cartoons for a while until I was ready to start watching documentaries. Okay, and the difference maker there is, like 3-4 months in, I was already like I said, watching documentaries or reading like comic books, or even pretty close to understanding series in Italian. And that's because of their similarities. But I think that the amount of time we need in order to be able to communicate in the language, I don't think it's much different. It's just that because, the amount of time in terms of hours of exposure to the language, not the amount of time that is going to take us to get there, meaning we're going to learn to communicate in a year and a half or in 2 years or in a year. No, I'm talking about the actual hours of exposure to the language. Okay, because you can learn a language for 2 years and listen to the language for 20 minutes a day or 2 hours a day, right? And even though, like, in both cases you're learning the language for 2 years, the amount of time that you're exposed to the language is way higher in the second case, right? So I'm talking about the amount of hours that it takes you to get to a point in which you can start communicating in the language. So because of it, because I'm going to get access to more complex and interesting materials in the Italian case, in the case of Italian, pretty soon I'm gonna be able to be listening or to be watching to resources in Italian for a couple of hours a day, to just throw up a number there, whereas with Polish, because they're not similar, it's gonna take me longer to get access to those interesting resources, which means probably I'm not gonna, I could, but I'm not gonna be as motivated to listen to Polish for 2 hours a day if all I can do is watch cartoons or enjoy simple materials, or that are not the most interesting thing in the world for us adults, right? So that's the first difference to me. Okay, and then another difference is, because of the similarities between both languages, if I listen to Italian for a couple of hours a day, probably, I don't know, like 90, even when I'm starting out with the language, maybe not like the same resource, or excuse me. Like if I'm listening to Italian for 2 hours a day, probably 95% of it is going to be comprehensible for me, right? Whereas the same 2 hours in Polish at the same stage, even though you're actually listening to the language for 2 hours, probably just 50% of it is comprehensible. So it may seem to you that you're actually listening to the language for 2 hours, while it's actually just one. Whereas with Italian, it's actually nearly 2 hours, right? So, like, it may seem like we've been listening to both languages for the same amount of time over a year or 2 year period, whereas you've actually not been listening to comprehensible input for as long in Polish as opposed to the Italian case. So to me, it's not about the language being more difficult or easier, but about those two little things that I talked about, right? Because if 2-3 months in you're already able to understand documentaries, nearly series, or young adult books, it's you're already there. It's all about you putting in the time, and just watching your favorite documentaries, reading young adult books, and so on, which is gonna keep you motivated in order to get exposed to the language for 2 hours a day if necessary, right? Whereas when you're starting out with a different language, because 2 months in, you're not going to be able to understand those complex resources and activities that you were in the Italian case, you're not going to feel as motivated to learn the language for 2-3 hours a day. You're probably going to settle for 20 minutes, which is understandable, and which is okay as well, right? And even if you do get exposure in the language for an hour a day, because of the difference between both languages, meaning your native language and Polish in this case, I throw like 50% out there, but I'm just making that up. But probably the same type of resource, you might be able to understand 95% in Italian and 50% in Polish. So in an hour, you're getting exposed to half an hour of comprehensible input in Polish, while you're nearly getting exposed to an hour in Italian. So that's also a difference. So in the end, it might seem like it took you a year and a half to get to a point in which you communicate in Italian, whereas it took you 4 years in Polish. So you think, Polish is much, much more difficult. But actually, I don't think the language itself is more difficult, because, once again, I keep getting back to the example of kids. All kids start, like in every single country, kids start speaking at similar ages, right? It's different for some kids and for other kids, but the range is the same whether your native language is Spanish or Chinese or Japanese and so on, right? So my point is, it's going to take the same amount of comprehensible input in order to acquire the language. But because of those little things that I talked about, it's going to seem like it took you way longer to learn another one, all right? And so that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and I thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to this episode till the end. I really appreciate it, and I hope it helped you out, like I said, and especially if you're one of those people who are interested in learning a language that might seem a little bit harder beforehand, or not as common, or not as popular, or this episode is mostly for you, because I don't want you to give up on it because of the general idea of that language being more difficult, because it's just it's not. And obviously, if you learn the language the traditional way, and you're from Spain like I am, obviously Polish is going to be way more difficult than Italian, right? But we already know that that's not the way to learn a language, and that's going to take you nowhere, whatever the language. So anyway, thanks again, and as usual, if you're listening to this on YouTube or any other platform where you can leave your messages, just feel free to do so, and tell me your opinion on today's topic. Any question, suggestion, anything related to the language learning process, feel free to let me know, because I'll be more than happy to help you out, and you'll be giving me ideas for future episodes, like I'm always saying. And that's it for today, my dear friends and language learning masters. So have a good day, whatever you might be, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye. Ciao.